welcome to this conversation on understanding human-animal interactions. I would like to remind in the beginning is uh, tomorrow is the World Environment Day, and it is very apt to discuss on this nature culture issues today. Okay, and this is the third in the segment of our alumni talk. Okay, and here we have two alumni with us, Shalvi, Suman, and Suchita, Sinha. Before we introduce you with the our alumni, would like to tell a little bit about the topic and why we need to discuss on this topic. Is that you see living in harmony with the nature. So, living in harmony with the nature has been an integral part of Indian culture, and this has been abundantly reflected in lot of traditional practices, religious beliefs, folklores, arts and crafts, musics, and various ample of examples that we have of the nature culture, human wildlife harmony. We have full in Hindu religion full of this you'll find in mythology and in various stories. Also in Buddhism, you'll find in many Jataka stories where you'll see a lot of interactions with human and animal. Okay, and virtually in all countries of the world, you will see the traditional practices of uh, uh, protecting nature in their ethics. Okay, so we know that we have so much things are in harmony with the nature, with wildlife. Then do we really need to have a discussion on this topic? But we think that we need to discuss on this topic, and for this discussion we have two alumni here. So Suchita Sinha is currently working at IIT Bombay in one of the project of the Ministry of Culture, Government of India. She and uh, Suchita Sinha was our alumni in 2017-2019 batch. So welcome, Suchita.
Thank you, sir.
The next speaker of today's topic is Shalvi Suman. Shalvi Suman is working on a project on in North Bengal on some coexistence project of human-animal interaction. Okay, welcome, Shalvi.
Thank you, sir.
So to begin with this discussion, that if you look at the Salvi's topic of the thesis, understanding the catalyst of coexistence through traditional knowledge systems of human elephant interactions, a case of Amchang Wildlife Sanctuary, Assam. So to begin with, Salvi, why did you choose this topic? We know that in like Assam, especially uh, the sanctuary that we have, the human animal conflict, we always come across with in news about human animal conflict. So why did you choose this topic? What actually enthused you to take this topic for your research?
So, just to elaborate it briefly, I worked on analyzing human-elephant coexistence through traditional knowledge systems that were evolved around their interactions. So going back on how I got into choosing this area of study, is it basically came out of my personal inclination on working with indigenous forest communities, and also a good inlet for us cultural people is community-based conservation. So from that, I got into biodiversity conservation, and that's how I ended up in working on coexistence. So this is and just to explain the scenario, it's very intense, and it's a very much needed interventions are required in this area of study. So that's how.
Okay, so the next question to you is that why did you choose the Amchang for your case study?
So like I said, I wanted to work with indigenous forest communities. So in our curriculum, we had to do a practicum. So just to kick start things, I applied for a practicum in Aranyak in Assam, Guwahati. So and there they handed me this site. So this was very close to Guwahati. So like it shared boundaries with Guwahati city, and Guwahati is the most metro city of biggest city of Northeast India. So it's expanding. So there are a lot of encroachments and different conservation issues that were prominent in this sanctuary. So one side it had a peri-urban context, the other side it had a rural context, and then inside the forest there were also forest dwellers. So it gave a very a good mix of different kinds of communities and different kinds of development exposure to the communities. So that's why I chose this and stuck with it.
Okay, very good. So coming from the rural and the peri-urban and from the northeastern part to the western part, I would ask Suchita. Suchita, can you let me first tell your topic of your research was urban wildlife in city level development and management practices, evaluation of the case of Ahmedabad city. So can you tell us first in the beginning is that why did you choose the topic of human wildlife interaction, and then why did you choose the Ahmedabad as your case study?
Again, like Shalvi said, it was personal inclination at first. Another point was when we, in our day-to-day lives, when we talk about urban cities being built or urbanization in general, we talk about how there is deforestation and we are moving into the forest and this patch of land is being cleared for development. But then again, where are these animals going? Where is this wildlife? Is it shifting to the outskirts? Is it there? Is there a space? All these were questions that I had. And when we think about deforestation or removing them from their space and building our own space, there is another question of what are we giving back? This has been a very big question all along. So we are giving them small patches in our landscape, but are they enough? Does this allow us to interact with them in a certain way? These were some of the questions that I had in my mind, and ultimately these formed the basic objectives or the questions that I asked through my thesis. And I think this was the basic reason that led me to
and why work. Did you choose Ahmedabad as your case study?
So very honestly, one of the things was that it was a very feasible site. We were placed in the city itself. But other than that, it proved to be a very good space for study. One, because it has a very diverse community. Given we have a range of communities that reside in Ahmedabad city, which include Hindu, Muslims, Christians, Parsis, Jains, and even a small population of Bene Israel Jews. And these, because there are so many different communities, there are so many different practices. And many of these practices, these religious impacts, are on wildlife as well, in some form or the other. So it was a good space to study this. Another reason was the presence of Sabarmati, which flows through the city, which I thought would be very interesting given that the banks of Sabarmati or Sabarmati itself would be a good ecosystem to explore. And then again, Gujarat also falls under the migratory bird central skyway route, which I later realized that Ahmedabad was important for me in that way also. So I think these were a couple of reasons that I chose this site.
Good that you talked about the Ahmedabad as a good ecosystem. I would like to extend this that you see in urban context, actually urban cities are actually very much conducive to many of wildlife. Like say for example, if you take an Ahmedabad case, we have so many monkeys, dogs, horses, cows, a squirrel, rats, everything very means well there. And also I'll tell you one thing more is that in urban cities they have also less number of less number of problems in the sense of less number of the health issues in comparison to the wildlife. But then there are certain other things also that urban stress that the animals do suffer. Okay, and then you have also exposed to the city. Okay, you have always stress of human and animal conflict. And as you said in the beginning about the deforestation, I would say that generally we say that the wildlife, comes into the city. Actually, it is that the city comes into the wildlife, because we keep on expanding the boundary of the city. Okay. So, can you further please explain to us, like when you selected this topic, so what specific research questions that you had in your mind? Okay. And means what methodology you adopted to address your questions?
Shalvi, do you want to go first?
Yeah, Suchita.
So there were 4 research questions. One was understanding what is urban wildlife, what comes under urban wildlife. Like you pointed out that there are horses, cows, dogs, cats, but do all of these come under urban wildlife? Because wildlife is a very specific term. It comes from a wild life, a wild living. So this was one of the questions. The second question was, what interactions do these species have with different people, in with people in different environments? For example, what interactions do they have in a religious background, with a very religious backdrop, with our knowledge systems, with space? The third was, do these interactions possess some threat? Are they important to us? What conflicts come out of these interactions, and can they be addressed? And the fourth question was evaluating the management policies that we currently have, the city development policies, the practices by the communities. Are they in some way catering or including urban wildlife? And if not, could they be made in a certain way that they are inclusive of these urban wildlife species? Could the community be also be practicing some things that could include urban wildlife, even if it is in their backyard? Could that be done? These were 4 research questions that I had. And the answer to your second question, the methodology was basically, one was research in itself, which was a huge chunk, which was studying urban wildlife. Again, studying urban wildlife in a urban fabric where people do not document things, which was a major challenge for me also, because there is no documentation. There is no certain organization or any governmental organization that works on documenting urban species in a way. The second was interviews and interactions, which was also a major chunk. So these 2 ways: one, I researched; second, I went to government organizations, NGOs, and general the communities in Ahmedabad who reside in Ahmedabad generally, to ask about how they have practiced, or have people practiced earlier, what existed earlier. These interviews I took. These were 2 ways.
Okay, thank you. And again, coming from west to the northeast, Shalvi, like we all know that about the human elephant conflicts. Actually, we come across with this issue in news every now and then, and we see that that the forest is not enough for the elephants' required resources. So they encroach, they raid the human houses looking for the food, etc., etc. And they in that process they actually also harm the humans. So we see also many death cases because of the elephants trampling on human beings. And then what we see is the retaliation from the humans equally in equal terms. Okay, so what specific questions did you have in your mind, and what means methodology that you adopted to address these questions?
So, I'll just elaborate on the basic scenario of, I'm sure a lot of people might be, new to this. So, like in India is a mega diverse country. It holds 7 to 8% of the recorded species of the world. And there are many cases where indigenous communities have been coexisting with wild animals and sharing the larger landscape since centuries. And due to this traditional coexistence with wild animals, this has, substantially contributed to a successful record in conserving some of the large mammals and their habitats, especially in the case of Asian elephants. So this establishes why coexistence is very important in for conservation. And now talking about the conservation issues, like Sir mentioned, the conflicts. So for sharing space and the landscape due to various ecological issues such as deforestation, like the biggest issue, and then let's say change in land use patterns, like Sir mentioned, encroachments and things like that. Now elephants depend heavily on crop yields that these communities residing, let's say, around the forest or uh, you know paddy fields or things like that. So they raid the crops. They, if not the crops, then the houses where these people store their yields. And so basically it's a very sensitive issue, and because there are heavy economic losses involved for the communities, matter of life and death involved. And then and as a matter of fact, the conflicts are escalating every year, and due to other pressures from politics and things like that. So this was one of the things that I the scenario that was presented to me. And now how I entered this was through traditional knowledge systems, because I had to bring in the cultural angle and focus on the cultural angle. So I tried to link coexistence to traditional knowledge systems. And for traditional knowledge systems, I focused on the traditional mitigation measures that the communities used. Um, let's say chasing elephants from the forest. What are the sustainable ways that people used to chase elephants from the forest, from their crop fields, in crop guarding measures that they took. And then I also focused on the religious rituals that they followed around elephants. So my questions were to just analyze a few different aspects of coexistence. That those were the, like I mentioned, the catalysts of coexistence, which is, and another aspect was to analyze coexistence in terms of changing time. Because like a lot of literature that I read, it was all about coexistence, but it kind of romanticized coexistence to a point where it's something that is stuck in the past and it's not changing. But coexistence, like one of the questions was just to analyze coexistence with changing times. And the other question that I wanted to address was, what were the different triggers that were hampering coexistence. So let's say poaching, infrastructural developments, deforestation, and things like that. And then just to the third one was to, like I mentioned, that I was presented with a different kinds of community, a big mix of communities around the sanctuary. So just to analyze different levels of coexistence that all these communities have had, and uh, what are the areas or points where due to which their level of coexistence differed. So this was how I went on about it. And the methodology that I followed was to just, the first thing was to map out the elephant movements and what were the places where the conflict was the maximum. And then just doing interviews, ethnographic interviews. And then also we also conducted a few awareness sessions with the people and with the forest officials, interviewing the forest officials, and then referring to documents that were drafted a very long time ago, which had no relevance today. So things like that were a challenge, but that's how I did this. Yeah.
Yeah. So okay. So taking from your what you said about the traditional knowledge system that they adopt, like the communities, okay, in the mitigation of the conflict, and there are certain rituals also they use. Okay, let me tell you one thing is that the elephant so is very revered, means animal in the Hindu tradition, so we see that means many families even cope up with this kind of problems even after like they get uh, problems from the human elephant conflict. They do not like to retaliate in that sense because the elephant is considered as very revered animal. Okay, is gone. So tell us a little bit more about the like how communities see the management issues through these traditional practices. Can you just elaborate a little bit more about like how community, like if we separate a little bit about from the government means initiatives and the policies, how communities actually using this traditional knowledge address this kind of issues and mitigate the human elephant conflict?
Let's say, like you mentioned, where people don't retaliate just because of these religious beliefs. So this is very prominent in many parts of India. Like I am also seeing this in North Bengal here. That government have a lot of compensation schemes and things like that in place for let's say crop raids or damages done by wildlife. So, but most of these people, because they are too marginalized and they don't have those resources, they can't claim those compensations. So it's a big challenge. But in a lot of cases that we've seen is that a lot of people don't uh, prefer claiming these compensations just because they feel that elephants will somehow get to know that they've this is like a complaint to the elephants, to the god, and now the communities might face some retaliation from the elephant just because they they tried to do this tried to file this complaint against the elephant. So this is a reason why a lot of people, indigenous communities, don't tend to file complaints. And for my side, it was a very tricky site because like I said, that it shared boundaries with Guwahati. So, and Guwahati is anyway expanding inside the sanctuary. So now there are a lot of illegal encroachments, and in that sanctuary, there were 45 to 60 elephants kind of trapped. They can't find their way out. So now, which is why there was a lot of conflicts happening here and there. And for the communities where a lot of migrant communities had settled on the fringe of the forest and the illegal encroachments. So what a lot of NGOs have done has they tried to evacuate them. So it was a very agitating point for these communities because they settled then, and now a lot of NGOs are trying to evacuate them with no plans of resettlement. So that was an issue for everyone. From at least one side of the sanctuary, which was the peri-urban area. So conducting interviews there was also a big issue because people were so agitated so that they didn't want to just address elephants anymore. So this was a very weird experience that I had of working with different conservation NGOs and different all these different people working in different in the same context, how they contradict your work, and then you have to work together somehow or the other. Yeah.
In terms of I think it was about traditional knowledge systems and community, which I'm figuring out, but is very different from Shalvi's.
Yeah.
Here, I think one of the important things was the community itself, of course, having a lot of traditions and practices around urban wildlife species, knowingly or unknowingly. One of them being the chabutras, that are constructed all around the town. These are the bird feeders and the water hodas for the birds and the animals. The second, I'm so sorry if you hear a background sound. The second would be again a practice in the Bhatyar Gali, which is in the old city, which was ritualized feeding, where they toss scraps of meat to the kites, which is somewhat an unspoken rule between the butchers and the kites that they do not take away their fresh meat or the meat that they cut for the customers, which we discussed while we were there. These are some of the practices that have been going on, that are old practices that have continued over time. And but then again, there are certain practices by the community that cause problems to the urban wildlife species, one of them being Uttarayan. Like I earlier said, Gujarat falls in the central skyway for the migratory species, and it is the time of the year where Uttarayan and the migration overlap each other. And honestly, it's a bloodbath in Ahmedabad at that point of time. In 2020, when I was doing my research, there were around 5,000 birds that were rescued, out of which around 500 died. This was just in the 1 week of Uttarayan that is celebrated. And these are a lot of migratory birds, a lot of kites that whose um, feathers are, whose wings are cut off by the manja. So these are some of the practices by the community that, of course, I cannot go up there and say we should stop it. But then again, these are some of the practices that do not help with the urban wildlife species conservation as such, even though there are a couple of practices that work for them. So these were some of the observations and outputs from the traditional knowledge system and communities that we had in Ahmedabad.
We're waiting for Professor Aditya to join, but till then, Saif has put a question up in the chat box. Maybe you can answer that till then. So, what important questions or aspects you feel were missed seeing the research now in retrospect? The revelations that you felt after these 2 years of working in a professional space. So yeah, now in retrospect, what do you think of your research now? You are muted,
Shalvi,
Shalvi.
you're on mute.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Like for me, it's a whole. It has changed everything. I mean, what we did in our, what I did back then was something because I continued my work. I did a practicum, and then when you're an intern somewhere, you are not exposed uh, to the realities of what how it happens. It's a very filtered layer that you are presented with, and then you just go there, you take interviews and things like that, but then you get the community perspective, but you don't understand what's happening at the level of, let's say, the government or in different NGOs or things like that. So this was missing in my research for sure. And now that I'm working here in North Bengal, so here I understand because let's say because I'm working in tea estates, so it's a different landscape, but there are communities which are migrant communities. So now they have been brought from somewhere else. Now they have put up, settled in some a different landscape. So it's difficult to understand because here the intensity of conflict is like, I mean, it's very heartbreaking to see because the elephants, and then there are also leopard conflicts and things like that. And in addition to that, I can see that these communities are so marginalized and they're not even asked, or they have no stake in becoming a decision maker, or we say that they are a primary stakeholder, but they're not in reality. So that is a struggle that I am facing right now. Yeah, maybe Suchita can continue.
Again, because I'm not pursuing something similar to what I did in my thesis exact right now, I do not feel there was anything left out or something that I thought would be very important to my thesis that I did not ask at that point of time. But one of the things that were left out was definitely community interaction. That was one of the major things that I wanted to do. But because of COVID and how everything was shut down for a year, that was something that was completely left out. Again, we talk about capacity building, creating awareness, talking to people, growing backyards and everything, but how feasible is it really? There, of course, it can be done, but would people like to do it? Are they really in planning to invest on it? So this was something that I really wanted to go on ground and talk about, but I could not. So I think this I missed. But otherwise, because urban wildlife is one of the subjects that has just begun, specifically in context to India. Um, Cities like Bombay or Bangalore or Pune, these cities have started doing something about it. They've started studying about it. But for my context, it was very new. So I feel everything that I asked, I felt it was very relevant and I did not miss out anything. But then again, I'm sure in the coming years, I would realize I left out something.
Yeah, maybe.
So Professor Aditya is still facing internet issues, but till then we are open to taking questions in. I wanted to ask one question from my end. Throughout your research and as Seth asked after your research in the past 2 years, can you possibly tell us about some good practices that you might have come across that did that were relevant to your case? Like for example, Suchita talked about the chabutra, how community pitches in to make sure that the birds are well fed and well watered. So maybe something like that, some kind of community practices in the modern context, urban, rural, either, that you found were helpful to the wildlife.
Okay, like I documented a few of these practices for different contexts that I was working with. So in the peri-urban landscape that was there. So a few years back, they had agriculture fields and things like that. They were growing paddy and everything. So on these, there were bigger trees and things like that in between the paddy fields. So it's very common here in the Northeast that they have these tree houses kind of a structure. It's called tongi ghar. So what I documented was every household, or let's say 2-3 households have had a tongi ghar. And what they used to do when the harvest season used to come, when the elephants generally raid. So what they everybody used to sleep on these tongi ghars, everyone from their household. And they used to because it was a big patch of agriculture field, so everyone was supposed to contribute in that guarding mechanism. So if let's say somebody in the west spotted elephant, so they'll communicate this message throughout different the tree houses that they were residing on, and then they'll take action as a collectively. So this was uh, one of the practices. The other was also something similar, but then I could spot evidences of animism in this. So this was when people, what they used to do, they used to have a small mandir sort of a thing, a temple, which was earlier it was just a stone, but now it's a full blown Ganesh temple. temple. So that's how changing times that I was mentioning. So what they used to do is whenever they used to have, harvest their crops, they'll just keep some portion of their harvest in next to that, close to that temple, which was on the fringe of the forest. And so now whenever elephants come, they'll just eat that, and till the time that finishes off, or whatever, they'll store their the crops in their houses. So this was an offering that they made to the elephant. But now is with changing times, with the present context is that now they, whenever is Ganesh Chaturthi, they'll you see the change in practices. So now they'll go there and they'll put some mithai or things like that, offer to the elephant in that temple. And now when the elephants eat that mithai, so elephants are very good at remembering and the smells and everything. So now the elephants walk into Guwahati city in search of those items. So that is a bad it does not find relevance in the current context, that practice. And a lot of other practices were also there. Like biofencing was one of the biggest good practice that I like. Are you guys aware of biofencing? Biofencing is something when you grow let's say paddy, and then on the periphery people maybe generally grow, let's say citrus plants, lemons, or chili or something like that, so that it masks the smell of the paddy and the elephants don't raid these crops. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, so I'm back. I'm sorry, it's very shame. My internet is so weak here. So I just want to know, like, Salvi, what you answered. Just can you give me a brief so that I can pick from there?
Sir, Bhavi just raised a question on different community practices that were, sustainable or were contributing to the conservation efforts.
Okay, so
Traditional communication.
connecting from that means I just heard you that you talked about the bio fencing, when you grow some other plants which can repel elephants, okay, and the crop is protected, right?
Yeah.
Hello. So tell us a little bit more about, like, we know that in many times what happens, that means many communities actually leave some crop for the elephants to eat, that is also practice. So have you seen this type of practice where the communities grow paddy and they keep a portion of the paddy for the elephants to eat? Have you seen such type of practice?
Not leaving the portion, but it's like if the elephants come, they raid, they eat some part of their harvest. They're okay with that. The communities don't generally, complain saying that, let's say they've eaten 20% of my crops or 50% of my crops. So it's like it's, for them, it's something that is, we are doing this. It's a loss that we are okay with. So we don't want, for a lot of cases that I've seen here and also in Assam, people are okay with some percentage of their crops getting raided. So this was something unique, and let's say it's a coexistence behavior. Yeah.
May I ask how have these practices evolved over time, and how would you see them evolve in the near future?
Evolve over time. So this is a lot of communities in India, like a lot of these large mammals in India have survived because of coexistence and the traditional coexistence that existed with indigenous communities, and how these people risk a lot of their personal lives just to accommodate these large mammals. So, yeah. Was the question? I could not hear the question properly, but this is what I came up with. Maybe.
So that's fine. Yeah. So you address the question, and just Suchita. Yeah. So just know, I just would like to know from Suchita, like what type of when you talk about the wildlife interaction in Ahmedabad city. So you looked into the both wildlife animals and plants. What did you choose? And what type of policies that you see the government is adopting to address this kind of issues?
So, sir, there were, I addressed particularly urban wildlife, which were animals, which were birds and mammals. There were, again, I would just quickly brief through the urban wildlife definition, which was, we divided it into 4 categories. The first one was human obligates, the one who are domesticated, for example, like the cattle, cows, horses. The second were human associates, the one who feed on something given by humans or in their trash cans or live in their nesting cavities. These. The third were human avoiders, basically someone who completely avoid the city grounds, that could be the deers that sometimes stroll into the city, and the fourth category were the predators or the basic wild animals, that were the leopards or the tigers that sometimes stroll inside the city. So I focused on the human associates, the one who coexist with us and the one that we interact with the most, which are the birds, the squirrels, the coyote, the foxes that stroll into the city. While I was studying this, I realized there aren't specific policies that cater to urban wildlife. When we talk about management, and when we talk about the types of management, there are 2 types of management of urban wildlife. One would be lethal, which would be killing them, trapping them, poisoning them. The second would be non-lethal, under which these management policies and guidelines should come. But starting from the basics, if we go to the Constitution of India, where it is a fundamental duty to safeguard environment, to be compassionate towards animals. Apart from this, I think there isn't anything that's specifically written for some species of wildlife in urban context. Everything that is protecting wildlife is in their wild area, in the forests, in those places. But when we talk about urban wildlife, there's nothing that was specific in terms of policies or in terms of practices from the side of the government that I could find here. But then again, there were certain small things where it was pointed out that this could be done, even though it was not being practiced in particular, but it could be done. For example, while we plan a town, there could be a green space that can be made. There could be a pocket of green space in some area which is very polluted. But is it really habitable for the wildlife as well? Is it that useful? Or are we just compensating for what we are creating? So these were some of the things that I realized while I was studying.
Good point. So before I take the questions from the participants, my last question to you. You mentioned about the birds, and nesting and all the creating green spaces for them. Okay, tell us a little bit about, like, if you see like the old monuments or old structures, there are plenty of spaces for the birds to do nesting space they have. Now in the modern buildings, the very rectangular buildings. So actually we do not see any space for birds for the nesting. So how do you see this in the modern context of the urban the construction? What we can do in the modern construction for that? Because in the old buildings, you see everywhere, you'll see the birds have places for the nesting. but in modern construction we don't see because they are very rectangular in shape.
So there are a couple of things here. One being, again, when we talk architecturally or we talk about construction of a certain space, it's not necessary that we construct something inclusive of animals as such in the facade or in the space itself. Green roofing is an example of making a space for the urban wildlife species like the birds, the pollinators, things like that. There's another thing which is a very important example is when we make glass facades. Again, you see birds bumping into them most of the times. A very simple thing that could be done, which has been practiced, not in India yet, but which has been researched, is making a grid of 4x2, a 2 feet horizontal and a 4 feet vertical grid. So it has been studied that birds do not enter such a confined space. They won't, no matter how small, how big they are, they won't enter this space. So making a confined grid of this area and putting glass on it could help, with the birds not bumping into glass spaces is one of the small examples that I can give. Again, making your backyard or any space, green space that you're creating, inclusive of animals. Again, we do not specifically know what we are planting. For example, even in Ahmedabad city, there's a garden department. What they plant is avenue plantation that would just look green throughout the year, which is not relevant for shade, for fruits, for pollination, nothing. So I think, again, it is important to understand what do we grow to cater to certain species, be it butterflies, bees. How can we go about it? A very another interesting example was when Tata Motors took 245 acres of their industrial area near Pune and made it into a wetland, just because they knew there was a presence of migratory species there. Of course, not everybody could go out there and put a huge chunk of their land and give it to them, but even Ahmedabad has a very big industrial belt in itself, and it has such a huge population of migratory birds. So these small things, even from ourselves or from the governments or private owners, I think these are some things that can be done from our side.
Interesting to know this. Thank you. So now we can take some questions, and the first question is from Tanushree. Tanushree, can you ask your question, or shall I read your question?
Also, actually, that question has been already answered by Suchita, a part of it. Yeah.
So do you have any other question than that?
I just want to ask about some of the animal acts like PETA, which works around in the urban area. So, like, how do they play a role?
Sorry, I don't think.
Can you repeat your question, Tanushree? We could not hear you properly.
Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah, so how do acts like PETA play a role in the urban area context?
Okay, so one of the things is these acts like PETA, like even IPC, Indian Penal Code, these protect animals from cruelty towards them. These protect from anybody causing any harm towards them. That is there. But then again, you would cause harm towards something that exists. The problem I was trying to cater was there are no spaces, or in future there won't be a lot of spaces in the urban area for these urban wildlife species to be in. Again, these acts do help in preventing certain form of poisoning or lethal management. As I said, these protect them towards them. But then again, my question was in my thesis also, we do need non-lethal management systems. We need to have these policies and acts in place not just to prevent cruelty towards them, to give them a habitable space, to manage our spaces in such a place that when we interact with these species, it is not in the form of conflict, it is interaction. It does not turn into human animal conflict, it is just human animal interaction, which would be a more positive way to look at it. So I hope I have answered your question.
Any other question? Any other question?
I think the same question can be extended to Shalvi also in the rural context, maybe. Like, how do these international agencies play a role in the rural context? I think maybe that would be a good.
For me, like, since I've started working here, so like I see a lot of people, you know, earlier they were focusing on these hardcore, let's say, documentation or research, what is the population density and things like that. But now you could see a lot of things happening in the you know, where communities are focused on, let's say, community-based conservation, uh, uh, initiatives on coexistence. There is, I mean, it could be argumented on what is happening under those projects, but then something's happening. It's in the conversation. So that is one of the things that are happening here. But then let's say there are also a lot of issues where she mentioned ethical issues, but then it's very difficult to, you know, bound ethics in this, you know, it's very, I don't know, it's difficult to answer this question because I myself have not understood it completely. It will take some time to maybe
So
some
if
experience.
I can ask you a question in this, in the terms that Suchita has mentioned, that the non-lethal management and lethal management. So obviously we are not looking for the lethal management, non-lethal management. So what kind of non-lethal management that can be adopted there to have means this human elephant conflict mitigated to a large extent? Because eventually they will have to interact, because elephant is a very far ranging animal, you know, they travel a long distance. So obviously the interaction will happen, but the conflict can be mitigated through non-lethal management. Can you explain a little bit to us?
I mean, like I mentioned, coexistence is, you know, gaining importance, and, you know, communities, that people are trying to focus on communities now. For me, you know, since, like I mentioned in earlier in the session, that traditional coexistence is something, you know, is one of the major reasons why a lot of large mammals have survived in India. So, you know, people or conservationists are trying to address that, acknowledge that, and take advantage from that, and you know, work with coexistence, and, you know, use the traditional coexistence to propagate the conservation messages, and, you know, just to give it some importance somehow. And I don't know if you guys are understanding or not, but, you know, people are trying to use traditional coexistence to
So the word
traditional
coexistence is very apt for this. So this word coexistence is very apt in this context, where there is the human and the wildlife interaction. So we look for the coexistence because this is the key word for the any management process. I would like to have some few more questions before we wind up these this conversation. Any question? Any question of any kind? So I can see Saif has written a question. Just it's a long question. Saif, can you ask yourself this question? Okay, let me then read his question. he says that a lot of site context conservation also aims at restoring historical landscapes, which further invites urban wildlife. Dilemma being these sites are now surrounded by urban neighborhoods. Could these be future ground for human animal conflicts? What could be done to mitigate the same? Yeah. So this question for both of you. You see the side this the urban cities are the boundaries are expanding and the cities are entering into the wildlife. So how the human animal conflict is going to happen more. So how to address this issue?
I'll answer this to the best of my knowledge. One of the things that I said when I worked on the subject was development is going to happen. We are going to move into forests. We are going to develop in that way. And yes, this would cause a lot more human animal conflict or human animal interaction, which is fair. But as he said, when we restore historic landscape or we are making something around a specific area or we are developing an area, again, the key point here is to have management policies or development policies in place that cater specifically to urban wildlife. In the sense, there are two types of development that can be done. One could be we are including urban wildlife in a particular space, and the second could be we are excluding it from particular spaces. Like we wouldn't want to house monkeys inside our home, but then again, we do not want to throw them out on the roads as well. Or same is the case with birds or kites or anything or bees. So then again, we should have, I think, practices or policies in place that cater to specifically these two things: spaces that we want them to be in, and we make sure that we have those spaces created where they can be, where they are restricted to that space, particularly that green area. And again, if a urban wildlife species, specifically, even if we look at birds, if a certain colony of birds has their fodder, their feed, or their nesting space at a particular place, they would not by themselves want to move into a concrete jungle or would by self want to move into a space that is inhabitable for them. So again, creating, we have green spaces right now also in Ahmedabad itself. We do have green spaces, but are they useful for the wildlife that we are trying to cater to? These are neatly trimmed gardens. There are shrubs. There are no huge trees, so there is no nesting possibility. There is no feed for them. Then again, what are these green spaces used for? Just avenue plantation, just for beautification. So again, the point is when we create green spaces, we create such spaces which cater to these species, which would habitat these species, and they do not move out of it. And again, there will be conflict, there will be interaction. I'm not saying that there won't be anything, but these are some ways that we could cater to it, not specifically mitigate it, but to cater to these things.
Yeah, thank you. Salvi, any comment on that?
I mean, the context is very different for me. Like, since now that I'm working in tea estates, which is like, the biggest landscape changes that you can see in the Northeast. A lot of trees, forests were chopped down, and now there are plantations here. So now, like for here, it's different because it's now the tea estates are also acting as a different sort of a habitat for leopards and for so. I would also try to add on to this in terms of the biodiversity or wildlife perspective, is that animals also adapt to these spaces. So whatever changes you put out, you bring, they'll try to adapt to it somehow or the other. If they can adapt, they will. If they can't, they'll just move out and maybe to some other space or try to be there, something like that. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Is there any further question or any question? Okay, so if there is no question, then we'll wind up today's session. So the today's sessions, the take away from the discussion is what I have jotted down is that you see that development is bound to happen, as both of the speakers agreed to that, and also some questions were asked regarding this development. And so the human and animal means interaction, I would not say at the moment conflict, interaction have to happen, and then the adaptation is the key. So human being also have to be adapted, and the animals also have to be adapted. If they do not adapt to themselves, then the conflict has to arise. Then also the coexistence is the keyword that emerged from the discussion. And so we look forward all the management process, how best we can coexist together, in which the government has to formulate policies and also have to look for the governance and implementation and management of those rules and regulations. At the same time, we also see the how the communities can manage themselves the conservation process and can help in coexisting both human and wildlife together. So, and the more all of that means when we talk about the biodiversity conservation, we see also the importance of documentation. So that means we know that which type of wildlife is nearing to extinction, or which type of wildlife we need to protect or need to be taken care of. And very well as elaborated by both of these speakers on the type of wildlife, okay, and the type of the management issues, type of the community interaction. With that, we hope to have many more alumni talk in a near future. And in this series, again, we'll come up with alumni talk with a couple of alumni will discuss about their thesis research. And this is a good time for us to understand from what actually they went into, because we generally we do not we may or may not go to Kaziranga to understand human-animal conflict. But if we listen to these speakers, then we get to know exactly the situation, what the situation is at the ground. So thank you all of you. Thank you very much. Thank you, participants, and the speakers, Suchita and Shalvi. Thank you very much. And Bharvi, thank you very much for all coordinating all this. Thank you, all of you. And bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, sir.